How small armies defeated massive empires. Massive armies usually win wars. That's the basic assumption most people grow up with. If one side has more soldiers, more equipment, and more resources, the outcome is pretty obvious. And most of the time, that's actually right. Numbers matter. More soldiers usually means more endurance, more flexibility, and chances to recover from mistakes. Throughout history, large empires built enormous armies just because overwhelming size often decides conflicts before they even begin. But history also has a surprising number of moments where that logic completely breaks down. Small armies, sometimes vastly outnumbered, have managed to defeat forces many times their size. Because of a combination of smarter tactics, better leadership, terrain advantage, and sometimes the simple fact that large armies come with large problems. In 1415, during the 100 Years' War, the English army found itself in what looked like a terrible situation. King Henry V had marched deep into France with an exhausted force of roughly 6,000 soldiers, many of them sick, injured, or worn down from weeks of campaigning. Standing in their way was a much larger French army, possibly 3 to 5 times their size, made up of heavily armored knights, noble cavalry, and experienced infantry. This should have been a short battle. Large, well-equipped army versus a tired, outnumbered one. History should have ended the story right there. But the English chose their ground carefully. A narrow stretch of muddy farmland surrounded by woods. This meant the massive French army couldn't spread out and use its numbers effectively. Instead of surrounding the English, the French were forced to attack in a tight, crowded formation, like trying to push thousands of people through a single doorway. Then came the rain. The night before the battle, heavy rain turned the freshly plowed fields into thick mud. French knights, wearing heavy armor and carrying large shields, had to advance across this mud while being squeezed together by the terrain. Every step was slow, exhausting, and unstable. Meanwhile, the English army had something extremely important: longbowmen. English longbows were powerful enough to punch through armor at certain ranges, and more importantly, they could fire rapidly. Thousands of arrows began raining down on the advancing French lines. Horses panicked, formations broke apart, and soldiers who slipped in the mud struggled to stand back up while more troops pushed from behind. The battlefield turned into chaos. The French knights, who were supposed to easily win the fight, arrived exhausted, disorganized, and already taking casualties. Instead of a powerful, coordinated assault, they stumbled forward in waves, tripping over fallen soldiers, stuck in mud, and unable to freely move. At that point, the English infantry stepped in to finish the fight. What was meant to be a crushing French victory turned into one of the most famous upsets in medieval warfare. Thousands of French soldiers were killed or captured, while English losses were comparatively small. Agincourt didn't prove that small armies always win. What it showed was something more important. Numbers only matter when you can actually use them. Terrain, preparation, discipline, and smart positioning can completely erase the advantage of size. The French army had more men, more armor, and more nobles. The English army had mud, narrow ground, and a plan. And on that day, that mattered far more. In 216 BC, during the Second Punic War, Rome decided it had enough of Hannibal. Hannibal had already defeated Roman armies multiple times, and Rome responded the way large powers often do when they're frustrated, by raising an even bigger army. At Cannae, the Romans assembled an enormous force, possibly 80,000 soldiers, one of the largest armies they had ever fielded. Hannibal, commanding the Carthaginian army, had roughly 50,000 men, significantly fewer, and far from home territory. The outcome should have been obvious. Rome had more soldiers, more reserves, and the confidence that comes from being the dominant military power of the Mediterranean. The Roman plan was simple: push forward with overwhelming infantry strength, smash through Hannibal's center, and end the campaign in one decisive battle. Hannibal, however, had a different idea. Instead of trying to match Rome's strength head-on, he deliberately weakened his own center, placing troops there that would slowly give ground as the Romans advanced. Meanwhile, his strongest and most experienced infantry were positioned on the flanks, with cavalry placed to deal with the Roman horsemen. When the battle began, everything seemed to go exactly as Rome expected. The massive Roman infantry block pushed forward, forcing Hannibal's center backward. From the Roman perspective, victory appeared to be unfolding in real time. The enemy line was bending, and their numbers were doing exactly what numbers are supposed to do. But the retreat was intentional. As the Romans pushed deeper into the center, their formation became compressed and crowded, losing flexibility. At the same time, Hannibal's stronger infantry on the sides began pivoting inward, slowly wrapping around the Roman flanks. Then the Carthaginian cavalry, having defeated the Roman cavalry, swept behind the Roman army and attacked from the rear. Within a short time, the Roman army found itself surrounded on all sides, front, flanks, and back, in what became one of history's most famous examples of a double envelopment. What had begun as a confident advance turned into a trapped mass of soldiers with no room to move. Packed tightly together, Roman troops couldn't effectively fight, retreat, or reorganize. The size that was supposed to guarantee victory now made the situation worse, turning the army into a massive, immobile target. By the end of the battle, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers had been killed, making Cannae one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. In 490 BC, the Persian Empire, one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen, launched an invasion of Greece. A Persian expeditionary force landed near the plains of Marathon, expecting what large empires usually expect when facing a much smaller opponent, a quick and decisive victory. Waiting for them was the army of Athens, joined by a small allied force from the nearby city of Plataea. Altogether, the Greek force numbered roughly 10,000 soldiers. Modern historians estimate the Persian force at roughly 20,000 to 30,000 troops, giving Persia a clear numerical advantage. Again, the outcome seemed predictable. The Persians had more troops, more resources, and the backing of an empire that stretched across continents. But the Greeks had two critical advantages: discipline and positioning. Greek soldiers fought as hoplites, heavily armored infantry trained to fight shoulder to shoulder in tight formations, using large shields and long spears. Many Persian troops, by contrast, were lighter infantry designed for mobility and ranged combat, relying heavily on archery rather than close-quarters shock fighting. The Greek commanders also understood the terrain. The battlefield at Marathon limited how effectively the larger Persian army could spread out and use its numbers. Rather than waiting to be surrounded, the Greeks made a bold decision. They advanced first, rapidly closing the distance across the open ground to reduce the effectiveness of Persian archers. Once the battle reached close combat, the advantage began to shift. The heavier armor, longer spears, and disciplined formation of the hoplites allowed them to overpower sections of the Persian line. The Greeks also strengthened their flanks while leaving the center slightly thinner. As the battle progressed, the stronger Greek wings pushed back the Persian sides and then folded inward, striking the Persian army from multiple directions and forcing a retreat toward the ships. What had begun as an invasion meant to demonstrate imperial power ended with the Persian force withdrawing after suffering heavy losses, while Greek casualties were comparatively small. When an army becomes powerful enough, it often starts expecting victory instead of preparing for it. Plans become rigid. Assumptions replace caution. Commanders stop asking, "What could go wrong?" and start assuming nothing will. Meanwhile, smaller forces don't have that luxury. They know they can't afford mistakes, so they think harder, move faster, and plan more carefully, not because they're smarter, but because they have to be. And that pattern shows up again and again throughout history. The decisive factor isn't always the size of the army. Sometimes it's the mindset of the people leading it. Because the moment you start believing victory is guaranteed is usually the moment you become vulnerable to losing it. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you're interested, you could also watch these ones. Please,